So my name is Sue, and I'm one of the writers of Women from Hackney's History, which is not that I'm plugging it, it's at the back. Currently writing the second one. So the women I'm going to talk about today are a mix of the ones that are in number 1 and will be in number 2. So that's just a bit of background, and this is where the research came from. So I'm going to be talking about votes for women, the whole suffrage campaign, and specifically about the local women, because I think the general perception of the whole suffrage campaign largely is the Pankhursts, some arson, setting fire to post boxes, breaking windows, that sort of thing. Possibly Millicent Fawcett as well, who was on the non-controversial side, and probably Emily Welding Davison as well, the woman who died under the horse's hooves in the 1913 Derby. But as I say, since this is the Hackney History Festival, I'm concentrating on the local ones, and they are a good bunch. I'm trying to roughly divide this into 3, because you have the original petition, 1866. Now, there were earlier ones, but this is when the organised campaign for votes for women started in 1866. And then you divide up into the suffragists, i.e. the non-controversial, non-violent ones, or non-militant, and then the WSPU, the Women's Social and Political Union, who took that decision after getting, quite understandably, a bit frustrated with the slow progress, that they decided to go into more militant action. And they are the suffragettes. Now, suffragettes was originally a derogatory term from a well-beloved Daily Mail, thank you so much, the Daily Mail, for calling them suffragettes, but the women involved decided to own that phrase and just took it. And so the whole suffrage campaign tends to be known as the suffragette campaign, which isn't entirely accurate, but they don't all fit in neatly into those categories. And why I'm starting here, this is a picture of Edith Garrod. Now, you know Edith as... Now, why I chose to mention her first when early on a Saturday morning I can't say jiu-jitsu at the best of times. So this is Edith Garrod, who was the jiu-jitsu suffragette. So she's about 5 foot tall, but she's a martial arts expert. And she runs a academy in Seven Sisters Road and near Oxford Circus. So she basically trains people in jiu-jitsu. She was the woman who arranged the suffragette bodyguard. Now, if you know anything about the suffragette campaign, it was violent. I mean, there was lots of demonstrations, lots of police brutality, lots of brutality from the public. There were quite a few people who didn't like the suffragettes at all, so they needed protection. So the Pankhursts devised this bodyguard, and it was Edith who trained them. However, she was Women's Freedom League, not WSPU. Now, the Women's Freedom League, as I'll explain as I go, are the ones who broke off from the Pankhursts because they did not want to be violent. So, Edith falls between those 2. But her connection to Hackney, we knew this when we wrote Women from Hackney's History 1, that she lived at 68 Stoke Newington Church Street. That much we knew. Since then, and this is a good example of how we've developed the research since, we've discovered she lived at 126 Albion Road as well when her daughter, Sybil, went to school at Oldfield Road. So we now have a second Hackney address for Edith. And we do have this campaign to get some plaques out, so who knows. She does have a plaque, Edith, in Islington. You might know it's in Thornhill Square. But yeah, I think she probably deserves a bit more than that. That picture, by the way, is from the British Newspaper Archive. It's from an interview on her 94th birthday. And she's demonstrating, so this is 1965, I think. She's demonstrating a wrist lock on a slightly worried-looking interviewer. So, yeah, I like that picture. Right, so this is how I'm roughly dividing it. So the 1866 petition, which is the beginning of the organised campaign, the suffragists, the more ladylike version, and the suffragettes. But as I say, they don't necessarily all fall into the same, easy into categories. So the suffragists, Millicent Fawcett, husband Henry is MP for Hackney. There you go, got a connection immediately. And a lot of the meetings they have, the fundraising they have, lots of visits by the Fawcetts. So they seem to be a sort of star turn at some of these events. Roughly 50,000 members. Difficult to tell because obviously they didn't keep, for obvious reasons, they didn't keep membership lists. But in 1897, Millicent joins together 17 different associations. It gets very complicated into the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. So, ladylike, law-abiding, fairly low-key. Petitioning, lobbying, marching, fundraising. Their HQ in Hackney is at 175 Amherst Road, which is opposite Hackney Down Station. Don't think the building is still, I mean, they're still at 175, but I don't think it's the same building. So I'll talk about some of those who are in Hackney. Suffragettes, 1905. I mean, 1905 is deeds, not words. You've probably heard about that. They've decided that all this campaigning, petitioning is not working at all. So we're going to go into some more deliberate, violent action. So they broke away from the National Union and formed the Women's Social and Political Union. And they had about 5,000 members, so comparatively very, very small. And they originally go into civil disobedience, like chaining themselves to railings, but then into deliberate criminal acts, so arson, bombing, breaking windows. And the Pankhursts who led the WSPU, controversial, I could talk about them for a very long time. They were very dictatorial. Some broke off, formed the Women's Freedom League after they decided to take criminal action. So the Women's Freedom League was still militant, but they weren't going to go round setting fire to anything. But also the Pankhursts were very, very dictatorial and basically wanted to choose their own committee. Then they broke off with Sylvia Pankhurst, who wanted to bring in working class women into the whole suffrage campaign. Not that they weren't in them entirely anyway, but it was very much a middle class, upper middle class campaign, and Sylvia didn't want that. Right, so 1866. Can you see that? It's a bit dark. Right, so this is a portrait of Emily Davis, not Emily Davison, Emily Davis and Elizabeth Garrett. So this is Millicent Fawcett's sister. The Garrett sisters were quite something. So Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, Millicent Fawcett are sisters. And this painting comes from 1910, so a good while later. And the sort of, the tradition was that they hid the petition under an apple cart, which is what they're doing there. The woman here has got an apple cart, and they're hiding the petition before handing it to the Liberal MP, John Stuart Mill. Painting is by a woman called Bertha Newcombe. Now, she's local. She is a member of the Artists' Suffrage League, which is one of these sort of side organisations. You had the Artists' Suffrage League, you had I'm trying to think of the other one. The Actresses, that was it, the Actresses Franchise League, and then there's a church suffrage, and there's all these individual ones. It gets a bit of a nightmare with the acronyms. So painting is by Bertha, and she was born in Lower Clapton. So the house is still there, actually. It's called Priory House. It's right next to the Old Mothers Hospital. But yeah, she was a member of the London Society for Women's Suffrage, so very, very involved, and she decided to paint this picture, as I say, a good while afterwards. So the petition had nearly 1,500 signatures. The Parliament website does have a transcribed list, and Anne Dingsdale has researched the Hackney women on it, so she's done a lot of work about which ones they are. There were about 40, I think 40, 41, mix of backgrounds, so complete teachers, dressmakers, shopkeepers, as well as the sort of leisured classes. In the book, we talk about a woman called Mary Ann Plummer and Augusta Johnston, but there were also people like the Dornbushes, who are a very interesting family. George Dornbush is actually buried in Abney Park, and he was a radical in every way you could possibly think of. Early vegetarian. If anybody knows Malvern Road, there's a house towards the end where it goes into Albion Drive. It's got vegetarian cottage on the pillar, and that was his. Yeah. If there was anything to rebel against, George rebelled against it. Anyway, that was his family, so they all signed it, but obviously he couldn't because he wasn't a man. He was a man. So they basically asked their social circles and their families and sent it around the country for a month, and that came back to Parliament, and of course it failed. Anyway, so Helen Taylor, she too is in Women from Hackney's History 1. This is her with her stepfather, John Stuart Mill. So Helen, another one you could talk about forever, but the Kensington Society for Women's Suffrage basically drafted that original petition in 1866, and one of those who drafted it was Helen Taylor. As it says up there, she's born in Shoreditch. Those houses possibly still survive. There's some rather grand houses down there, but it's now Christopher Street. Not sure of the numbering, but it gives you a good idea of what it would have looked like then. So a rather grand Victorian portrait there. I do like that. It's fabulous. And yeah, Helen, lots and lots to talk about. Anyway, as with this woman, this is Harriet. Now, this is a good example of someone who signed the petition, but she wasn't living in Hackney at the time, but she did live in Hackney. So she signed it while she's at a townhouse in Savile Row, of all places. Now, the Savile Row house does have a plaque, but it's to her husband, George, who was MP for the City of London. But in 1826, she was living in Stoke Newington, in her country house, because at the time, Stoke Newington, very green, very lovely place to have your country house. Her townhouse was in Threadneedle Street. This is how rich they were, okay? Above the family-owned bank, Prescott and Grote, which is now part of NatWest. So, Harriet, extraordinarily rich, extraordinarily unconventional, I think is the word. She spoke at the 1869 conference on women's suffrage, so that's the first one to actually concentrate on women's suffrage. But from my writings, this is my research from Women's from Hackney History 2. So, early supporter of women's suffrage, writer, biographer, radical parliamentary reformer, patron of women artists, and political influencer. Loads of people, there's loads of quotes saying, if she was a man, she would have been a better MP than her husband, and she would have been a leader of a party. Any party. There you go. So, lovely, lovely quote from Queen Victoria. She obviously moved in very, very high circles here. Very peculiar. Clever, masculine. Okay, fine. And her biographer, he was quite sympathetic. Her manner, until the first impression wore off, was certainly rather alarming. She does seem very eccentric and rather charming in my view. But she was very much a political organiser. She was running the show. And yeah, she's another one you could talk about forever. And I'm really going to have to cut down that entry because it's supposed to be 500 words and it's over 1,000 at the minute. So, Harriet, a bit of a heroine of mine, I have to say. So she's in, a lot of these are in Stoke Newington. I think about 90% of them are in Stoke Newington, which possibly, is something to think about. One who isn't in Stoke Newington. Now, this came up recently. Romany Reagan is doing some research in the archives at Sutton House, so picture of Sutton House. And Eliza Temple, who ran a house on the west side, you may know with Sutton House, going tomorrow, you'll note it was divided into two. So the west side of Sutton House was called Mitford House, and Eliza Temple signed the petition, but she ran a school here from the 1840s for about 40 years. So a good example of Hackney's schools, and that's another one you could talk about forever. And about 20 boarders, possibly day pupils as well. But Eliza is on the suffrage petition at Mitford House. Right, Sophia. Now, Rosie, whoever she is probably going to go, because Rosie has written the entry for Women's Hackney History 2 for Sophia. Now, she's another one you do wonder when she slept. She signed another address, so she signed the petition, but another address. She was at Adelaide Road in Hampstead by then, but she lived in the house which is where Defoe lived in Stoke Newington Church Street. So we've got Defoe Road now and a plaque to Daniel Defoe. She actually lived on that site. We still haven't decided whether it was the same house, but it was definitely the same site. And she's a writer, philanthropist, teacher. She actually taught Ada Lovelace, the original, sort of computer pioneer. She is a friend of John Stuart Mill. They all sort of moved in the same circles. Co-founder of Bedford College, which is the first higher education college for women. And importantly, she's an abolitionist. So she's involved in the campaign to rid the country, the world, of slavery. And this is an important thing because there's an awful lot of links between the early women's suffrage societies and the ladies-only anti-slavery committees. So you do find a lot of the people who were involved in abolition turned into suffrage societies. And Sophia is a good example of that. Right, Florence Fenwick Miller. Now, she's another one. I've applied for a blue plaque for her. Unfortunately, it won't be in Hackney if they do get it, but, She was on the London School Board for Hackney, and the London School Board was the first public organisation to allow women to be voted in. So she is on there from the age of 22. She wins elections 3 times running. And she's the founder of the Women's Franchise League in 1889. And she's the woman who, if you've kept your name on marriage, you have her to thank, because she had a fight with the London School Board. When she got married, she wanted to keep her name. So she wanted to change from Miss Fenwick Miller to Mrs. Fenwick Miller. And she had to actually go through a court case, and she won. So, yeah, thank you, Florence. So she won 3 terms, as I say, so early 20s onwards. She was a physician. I mean, this is obviously before women technically could become doctors. She's actually working as a midwife and a physician from Cadogan Terrace at the age of 18. She had to earn her own living as well, so, she becomes editor-owner of the Women's Signal, which is a really early feminist publication. And she attends lots of international conferences. She's friends with Susan B. Anthony, for example, so if you know anything about the American suffrage society, whole societies, Susan B. Anthony is one of the big names. And her daughter, Irene, who is a really good example of it's really difficult to research women sometimes because they change their names. So she was known as Irene Fenwick Miller, Irene Fenwick, Irene Miller, and Irene Ford, which was her father's name. So she's a nightmare to research. But Irene was born at 18 Grosvenor Avenue, which is off Newington Green, which is one of the ones I have applied for a plaque for, because they'll get 2 for the price of 1, because they'll get Florence and Irene. And Irene is the first woman to be arrested. 1906, she's in Downing Street, and she's the first woman to be arrested for demonstrating in London. So there you go, mother and daughter. Right, now this is a rather hazy photo to look at, but it is from the newspaper, so you'll have to forgive me. But this is a sort of fairly low-key example. She is the wife of the mayor of Stoke Newington. He's a bit of a scumbag, I'm not going to talk about him. But basically, lots of their fundraising events. They live at New Lynn, Nordship Road, one of those huge houses, which were really, really sought after and full of, they had a wall about 5 servants. They were massive houses. So Ada took me ages to find her first name. Really, it was just, Anyway, they previously lived at 36 Clissold Road, so they're very, very local. And yeah, also with the Coombe bit, I mean, you could spell it about 300 different ways. So now she's always listed as a housewife in the censuses, but she is running a lot of fundraising events in around the early 1900s. But fairly low-key and very definitely a suffragist not a suffragette. And on that subject, Carrie Eve, who's in the first book, she's the first mayor of Stoke Newington. When we wrote the book, we didn't know she was involved in suffrage at all. But then we discovered she was, and we now have lots of references to her actually hosting events at her home in Albion Road. So again, that shows how research changes over the years. So how am I going? Right, I might need to speed up a bit. Anyway, Theodora is next. So Theodora Bonwick, she's one who's not in Stoke Newington, yay. Enfield Road, so de Beauvoir, the building is still there, if you know the school. But she joined the WSPU in 1905. She is actually friends with the Pankhursts, and there's a few letters going backwards and forwards between them at the time of the split with Sylvia, basically saying, I'm really sorry this has happened, it's really shouldn't, can't we get something sorted here? Obviously she failed on that, but yeah, she's close enough to the Pankhursts to be able to try and influence them. Her first speech on women's suffrage is age 17. Enfield School was used a lot for suffrage meetings. I suppose being headmistress there, she had the perks of being able to use it as a venue. And she's a speaker at the so-called Women's Sunday in Hyde Park in 1908, which is the first, I've heard it called a monster meeting. I don't think the suffragettes called it that, but anyway. So women from all over the country gathered in Hyde Park, and they were probably about 50 speakers, and Theodora was amongst them. She was a progressive teacher, trade unionist, prominent in the fight for equal pay, and she was an advocate of sex education in schools and was the first to get the subject on the curriculum, and that was at Enfield Road. So another one, you wouldn't necessarily know about, but she made a huge difference to people's lives. Louisa. Now, we're back to Stoke Newington. 22 Paget Race. Now, Louisa, journalist, editor, artist, first woman to chair a company. So she moved from the non-militant NUWSS to the Women's Freedom League, and she actually left the money in her will, so must have been okay when she died. She was quoted saying, "Do I approve of militancy? Most certainly I do." I don't know if she spoke like that. She was consultant editor of The Vote, the Women's Freedom League newspaper, and she was a director of the publishers Minerva. She took part in a picket of the House of Commons. She was on the Tax Resistance League, which was another one, even though women couldn't vote, they still had to pay tax. So, yeah, there was a lot of campaigning against that, which I'll come across later. But her goods were sold. So basically, you refused to pay your tax, your goods were seized in order to pay your tax bill. And then usually what happened is a bunch of suffragettes turn up in a procession and buy the goods back and give them back. That's the way it worked. They got a lot of publicity out of it. But she specialised in company law and procedure, and she must have been a nightmare at shareholders' meetings because she used to turn up all the time, say, "You're badly run," ask lots of questions. And she becomes the first woman to be chair of a company for a company of restaurants called Slater's in 1925. Sadly, she dies in 1926, so she doesn't actually get much time to run it, but she still is listed and quite rightly recognised as being the first woman to actually head up a company. So, when she was also a cartoonist. Now, I realise you couldn't probably read this. These are all held by the Museum of London. There's a whole series of them. And she's done that, and I love the fact that she's got dedicated to the ASS here. Anti-suffrage something, I must admit, but it's a nice acronym. Anyway, she did a whole series of these, and I thought I'd just show you a couple of them. But yeah, she was a very talented artist as well as everything else. And she also had curvature of the spine for her entire life, so she actually was in pain all the time, and she still managed to get all this done. Which makes me feel ashamed. Right, Sarah Mustard, Gladys Evans. Okay, Sarah Mustard is on your far left. And Gladys, make sure I don't trip over the wires here. This is Gladys here at the back. So this is a good example. Sarah Mustard is a fairly low-key. She's a teacher. She's the president of the Hackney branch of the Women's Freedom League. She's also secretary of the Women's Freedom League toy factory in South Hackney. So they trained up people to actually earn a living. really. I think that was in Terrace Road, Victoria Park. We can't quite pin that down. But they held sewing meetings at 22 Terrace Road, so I'm thinking it's probably there. But she lived in 2 addresses in Clapton, 81 Mildenhall Road and 49 Moresby Road. And her husband John also spoke at suffrage meetings, so probably well in tune with each other. So lots of speaking events with a woman called Priscilla Le Creuset, who was secretary of the Hackney Women's Freedom Leagues. Lots of things like socials and whist drives. And Priscilla lived at Navarino Mansions, which are still there. So Sarah Mustard, reasonably low-key, but Gladys definitely not. We come on to our first real militant here. She's WSPO 1908. Her father and grandfather, by the way, are both journalists and they're both buried at Abbey Park. She isn't. She's actually died in Los Angeles, believe it or not. But that's another story. 2 addresses in Stoke Newington. Again, Elm Lawn is one of those huge, beautiful houses on Woodbury Down when, you've got the river, you've got the water views and absolutely gorgeous. You can see lots of pictures of those online. But Gladys, she worked at Selfridges when it first opened, and then she left to actually run a WSPU shop. And there you go. There's a lots of mixes up of this story, but essentially she goes to Dublin with Jenny Lee, and they attack the Theatre Royal in Dublin because Herbert Asquith, the Prime Minister, is due to speak there. Now, the theatre is empty, so it's not as if there's a going on. But still, let me see. Gladys was seen to throw a burning rag into the projection box at the back of the stalls, and then to run towards the stage and throw a handbag filled with gunpowder and matches. Mary Lee threw a burning chair into the orchestra pit. Several small explosions occurred. So, they were very definitely making a point, and there you can see what they got. So 5 years in Mountjoy Prison in Dublin. And yeah, it's quite, I'm going to have to sort of brush over a bit the hunger strike because I'm running out of time. But a hunger strike for 58 days. She did have to come out and recover in Switzerland. And then, her story becomes a bit odd in that she apparently, during the First World War, she actually drove a supply truck, acted as a chauffeur for a relief mission in Belgium, and then she took a beautician's course in New York. Apparently she was working illegally, so when she developed dementia, her family had to somehow get her into some sort of charity nursing home, and that's why she ended up in Los Angeles. But yeah, Gladys is an interesting one. Alice Paul. Now, if you know your American suffrage history at all, Alice is up there. There is currently a house on Constitution Avenue in DC, anyway, near the Capitol, and it's called the Alvington Paul House, and it's now a national monument. It was granted that status by President Obama, and that is Alice Paul. So she arrives in London. She arrives in Birmingham. She actually was at Birmingham University in 1907. She's here for 3 years, but she fitted quite a lot in. She was training essentially as a social worker. She did that, sort of economics and social sciences at the LSE, and then she was training and working as a social worker. And this is where she works in Dalston and in Hoxton for the wonderfully, wonderfully named Society for Organising Charitable Relief and Repressing Mendicity. Anyway, Dalston Junction. The building is still there, right by the bus stop. It's now a closed shop. The one in Hoxton where she was actually trained at was in Niall Street, as far as I can work out. But Alice's career as a serial window breaker, she broke windows at Dundee Police Station, and then her famous one was at the Guildhall. She disguised herself as a cleaner, hid overnight, again when Herbert Asquith was due to speak, and when he did start to speak, she broke the window of the roof with her shoe and shouted down to him, "Summoning all my strength, I shouted at the top of my voice, 'How about votes for women?'" Anyway, that was just an example of what she was up to. And then she went back to America. So essentially she was imprisoned, I think she was imprisoned more than 3 times, but 3 times in England. She was definitely imprisoned in the US as well. So yeah, another one you could talk about for a very long time. But she lived into her 90s, and she was actually interviewed when she was mid-80s, and that's where we came across the reference to Dalston and Hoxton. She was very concerned about having her bicycle stolen. Anyway, I just thought I'd show that. I mean, obviously it's just because of the alphabetical nature, but there's the Pankhurst arrest record, and there's Alice over here. So she's at Bow Street and Thames Magistrates Courts and Guildhall and Glasgow, so that sort of records what they were all up to. They're all in ancestry. And there's a nice picture of Alice with Sylvia Pankhurst on a tour of American prisons. There you go. Right, Ethel is in the book. She's buried at Abney, so secretary of the Ilford branch of the WSPU, and she's arrested for fly posting. She's force-fed, put in solitary confinement. She's also a 1911 census refusenick, so they had this whole protest about avoiding the census in 1911, and there's quite a few of ours who did that. There was a party at a skating rink in the Aldwych, and there was also a big party of 40 Hackney women run by a woman called Elizabeth Bennett, who I think is Elizabeth Wilkes, who's another one in the book, and she was also tax resistance. Speeding through, Edith. Edith, in her uniform as the Women's Volunteer Police with Nina Boyle, who's another huge suffrage person. She's born in Hackney Workhouse, is Edith, so great start to life. And she's the WFL court correspondent for the vote, and it's rather ironically called the protected sex, because basically she's outlining what women get for, the suffragettes are being shoved in prison, but this is what men are up to, and they don't get quite so much, do they? That's essentially what she was saying. But Edith is one of my absolute favourites. Right, I know I'm short of time, so I'm going to run through. Olive, this is a police surveillance photograph from Holloway Prison, basically under the Cat and Mouse Act, where suffragettes went on hunger strike, force-fed, got quite ill, obviously. They were then let out to recover, and then they were pulled back in again. So that was why it was called the Cat and Mouse Act. But in order to get them back in, the police had to know what they looked like. So Olive used a false name a lot of the time, partly because she had to earn her own living, so, nobody was going to employ her if she had an arrest record. And she was part of what was known as the Young Hot Bloods. Now, this was a group that the Pankhurst pulled together that had basically under 30, no dependents, because they knew what was going to happen. They knew they were going to end up in prison. So Olive is in prison 3 times for arson. She smashed up her cell at Holloway. She taught Russian at Finsbury Tech, and she spoke 6 languages. She ran the Women's Suffrage Federation operations in Oxton, and she ran a typing and translation business in 93 Bishopsgate. Yeah, she's another one who lived into her 90s though, so tough women, and there she is with her arrest record as Phyllis Brady. Myra, Tax Resistance League, lovely story. When I was researching some people at Abney, Kate Riley is another suffragist who's buried at Riley. There's a story that Myra, who lived, again, Woodbury Down, she's a poor law guardian in Hackney. She worked with the East London Federation of Suffragettes, so that's Sylvia Pankhurst lot. She actually invited some East End women down to her house in Malden in Essex for days out. And when she got married, she actually dressed the church in WSPU colours. There you go. I am rushing now. Anyway, the 1911 census protest, you can probably read that. No persons here, only women. And this is one actually from Stoke Newington. Another one, can't find her first name. Miss R. Scriven, occupier, 131 Holmley Road. Can't find her first name for the life of me. Anyway, once I do. And there's Irene. So when I was talking earlier about our mother, Florence, there she is, being arrested. And finally, Mary. Now, anybody who was there yesterday knows you were asked to sing. I'm not going to ask you to sing. Don't dilly-dally on the way, don't worry. Mary Lloyd was a huge suffrage supporter, and I think that should be recognised. So she was a member of the Actresses Franchise League, also people like Alexandra Carlyle will be in number 2. Athene Seiler, Ellen Terry, Lily Langtry, Sybil Thorndike, they were all part of that. But Marie appears in a suffrage play, loads of fundraising events, and she also smuggled the militant suffragette Annie Kenney into the theatre in her costume hamper. And Janet is waving at me. That's the end. That was a run through. There you go. Phew. I think. Questions? We've got about 5 minutes, I think. Hello. Yes.
Did any of these women suffragists, did they carry on into radical politics in the 20s and 30s and 40s and things like that? Or did they drop back out into quote normal?
Well, the Women's Freedom League carried on until the 50s, 60s. So some of them, yeah, they would have still been involved. But of course, once 1928 gets there, oh God, we're not far from the anniversary, are we? Basically, that whole point has gone. They've got suffrage and that's it. So I think a lot of them did sort of fade back. I mean, people like Ethel Haslam, we know, just once it was done, that was it. Others, I haven't come across one way or the other. I mean, certainly people like Edith Watson carries on. I mean, she's an interesting one because she goes into acting. She works for the divorce union, so basically trying to reform the divorce reform law. So yeah, it's a bit of a mishmash. Some of them did. Some of them didn't. I suppose it's actually their situation that affected it. But yeah, it's a bit of a mishmash. Anyone else? Yes. Hi, Laurie.
You mentioned Navarino mansions.
Yes.
Which makes me wonder whether there were any or many Jewish suffragettes or suffragettes.
Lots. Nettie Adler. She also lived in Navarino Mansions. And at one point, certainly during the First World War, almost those entire blocks were filled with women. If you look at the roll for Navarino Mansions, I think it's 98% women, but I presume that's because of the First World War But yes, there's lots of Jewish people in Navarino Mansions, presumably because of the sort of philanthropic background to those buildings. Was that about the 4%?
It was the Jewish.
Yeah. The records I've looked at, yes, heavily Jewish. Yes. Anyone else? Yeah. Hi.
Oh, thank you. It's really interesting.
Thank you.
Just to comment, some women went into reforming the criminal justice system in campaign. Some of them became JPs.
Yes.
I mean, obviously not the local ones, all you would know, but just generally.
I think once they got a sort of taste for public life, they were out there. Yeah.
The abolition of the death penalty, which actually took 40 years. So I've researched some of these people. But some of them did go into other forms of politics or becoming councillors.
Yeah, I think from the whole campaign, they suddenly got all this sort of comradeship and the whole sort of focus of something, and they wanted to carry on in public life. So I think, from your question, I think it's another piece of research to try and work out what they were actually doing afterwards, because that would be interesting. I'm sure there was sort of marriage, kids and everything got in the way, but there were certainly some that worked on. Anyone else? Yeah, that was a bit of a sort of whistle stop, but the research will continue.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.